Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's virtual evening lecture, Hippie Vancouver, Activism in the 60s and 70s and its Legacy. My name is Sarah Carlson, and I am the Program Manager of Vancouver Heritage Foundation. And I have the pleasure of being joined by Michael Kluckner, and we're both so delighted to have everyone here with us today. Before we go any further, I'd like to acknowledge that the work of VHF takes place on the traditional, ancestral, unceded lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. And many of us are joining from these lands this evening. Some of you might be joining us from elsewhere in either the province or perhaps in the country, and I invite you to reflect on the Indigenous peoples whose traditional lands you occupy. VHF is a registered charity that promotes the appreciation and conservation of heritage places in Vancouver. We do this through educational programming like these lectures, special projects, informational resources, and grants. This evening's presentation is the first virtual evening lecture of the 2022 spring season. And although we can't be together today in person, we're really grateful for our program partner for this series, the University Women's Club of Vancouver, and in particular, Kathy Barford for working with us to offer this series at Hycroft Manor since 2012. We do have a full lineup of virtual programming planned throughout the spring, and look forward to providing more updates on additional programming and some in-person events that are coming up. So stay tuned for more about that. So I'm just going to take a moment now to introduce our speaker tonight, and then we can make a start. So Michael Kluckner is an artist, illustrator, and author of several books on Vancouver's history, including Vancouver Remembered and Vancouver, a member of Vancouver Heritage Commission, and a president of the Vancouver Historical Society. So thanks so much, Michael, for being here with us this evening, and over to you.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm presuming with a thumbs up that my audio is working okay, and a nod. That's very good. So subject tonight, activism in the 60s and 70s and its legacy in Vancouver. I use the term hippie guardedly. It has positive connotations for some people and negative connotations for others, but it does identify an era. And so we're talking about the period from mid to late 60s in Vancouver through about 1975, and asking ourselves, what is the legacy? Is there any significant legacy other than nostalgia and maybe some good music from that period? First off, the biggest challenge about giving a talk like this is that all of the images that I might use, all the photographic images, are within copyright. And so I want to just take a minute to talk about what sources I've used. When you see the black and white images, like at the top left of the screen, the drawings, those are from my book, The Rooming House, which I've just done, and is talking about that period in a fictional way. It's sort of nonfiction fiction. There are two very good books on the Georgia Strait. One that was written about 30 years ago, a little more than 30 years ago, by Naomi Pauls and Charles Campbell, called What the Hell Happened? And you see the title of it there. Then 50th anniversary, 4 years ago, I guess now, there's a book, Georgia Strait, A Celebration, 50th Anniversary, with that is mainly cover artwork and some essays about that period. There's also the Lawrence Aronson book that came out, New Star Press published it in 2010, and a bit academic. Doesn't really capture the flavor of the time, despite its quite wonderful cover. And that's another source that you can find. And then the photographers and the people who directly helped me, Sven-Erik Eriksson, photographer, who later on had a career with the National Film Board. You will see acknowledgements to Pugstem Publications' Vancouver Express in 1970. The Express was the strike newspaper of Pacific Press employees that published for about 5 months in 1970. And all of its images are held in the City of Vancouver archives, and that's where the kind of copyright release comes from. Kevin McKeown was very helpful, and Angus McIntyre also. Set the stage. Who was in charge? Well, people thought of it as a Trudeau-mania period. Pierre Trudeau elected in 1968 in a landslide. We looked so cool compared with the Americans who were electing Richard Nixon at that time. But in 1972, the bloom had definitely gone off his lapel rose, and the Liberals were barely reelected. They only got 2 more seats than the Progressive Conservatives under Robert Stanfield. Progressive Conservative, a classic Canadian oxymoron. And it was due to the NDP and this corporate welfare is bum slogan. However, the Liberals came back into power with a majority in 1974. Locally in charge, finally the wheels fell off the Social Credit Party in 1972 after 20 years, and a quite radical NDP government came in under Premier Dave Barrett, and I've just highlighted a couple of his cabinet ministers there. Norm Levy was the Minister of Social Services, and that was a very important portfolio at that time. And then also Rosemary Brown was the first Black person, if not Black woman, elected to a provincial legislature in Canada. People were on the road. Thousands of young people were hitchhiking back and forth across Canada, across the United States, up and down the West Coast. People were moving around, and despite the fact that as they moved around, they would tend to lose touch with their surroundings because, of course, there was no internet, there was no email, people didn't have telephones, this sort of thing. But people were nevertheless going from place to place to place and looking for, I guess, a better place to live during that time. Probably the biggest issue that had an impact on that period was the Vietnam War. And Canada had a rather convenient out, a convenient way not to get involved, because Canada was the non-communist country on the International Control Commission, which had been set up to monitor the demilitarized zone between North Vietnam and South Vietnam in the 1950s. The other members were Poland as a communist member, and then India was a neutral chair. So we were a United Nations body involved in the preservation of the peace. And so we weren't going to send soldiers. That didn't mean that the issue wasn't very controversial here, but you can see from the statistics there how few people, by 1968, and of course this number increased as the time went on, how few people actually sympathized with the war resistors and the draft dodgers who began to come to Canada in the mid to late 1960s. Just a few little images of that time, of the demonstrations, of the publications that were happening then. And it's really impossible to overstate the impact that the Americans who came to Canada have had, and on Canada and particularly on British Columbia. We think about Americans coming to Canada during that period as being draft dodgers or war resistors or deserters, but it wasn't necessarily the case. Stan Persky, for example, had done his military service, his drafted military service before coming here. It's also really worth pointing out how many women came. And and you hear estimates of 50,000 Americans to over 100,000 Americans came to Canada during that period. Probably half of them were women. A very large number of them were women with teenage sons, with young sons, who were concerned that their sons would get caught up in the draft. And so we acknowledge them also, and throughout this I'll be making references to the contributions that they made to British Columbia and to Canada. In BC, of course, they didn't all come to Vancouver. A very large number of them went to the Kootenays. Robert Inwood is a good example of that. He was not chosen in the draft lottery at the time, but he came anywhere, wanting to get away from what he saw was a militarized American state and all of the injustices he found. And so he moved to the Slocan Valley in the 1970s. An array of his publications are there. He was doing that, but you might also recognize his work because he was the key designer on the heritage revitalization of the Nelson streetscape, Revelstoke, New Denver, a number of other places up in the Kootenays, and then even elsewhere in British Columbia. So he was a kind of an architectural designer and a heritage enthusiast, as well as being an author and an artist. So we're talking about the long decade of the 60s, and it's a term that is often used, you know, the 1960s, and then continuing on through, as I mentioned, to about 1975. I always figure that when disco began to get popular, that was the absolute end of the 1960s as we had known it. And people began to cut their hair or maybe style their hair and buy suits and get jobs and so on and so forth. And a lot of the people that I'm talking about are white, middle-class, well-educated kids who typically made up the bulk of the hippie population. We'll talk a little bit more about this as we go on. The three essentials of life at that period were sex, drugs, and rock and roll, we are told, and probably pretty much true. And in terms of the rock and roll, this was the period of the outdoor concerts in Vancouver, the Easter Be-ins that began in 1967 and continued for a number of years. When I think of that period, I think more of crowding together with 20,000 of my closest friends into the Coliseum and the excitement of it and the absolutely deafening noise of seeing a big international band coming through. But also there were other places that came up, and particularly by about 1973, 1974, when the NDP government provincially began to liberalize the liquor laws. And so you got places like Rohan's Rock Pile that could serve liquor opening up in areas that previously that hadn't been possible. If before that it was a cabaret license and it was in the downtown area. And so, you know, the famous clubs of the early years, and whether they go back into the 1940s or the 1950s, they were in the downtown. But here's Rohan's Rock Pile on West 4th near McDonald, and open up full facilities, that wonderful Canadian mysterious atmosphere, which meant that they could serve liquor. And this replaced, or I guess was an evolution of the some of the earlier places in Kitsilano. You think of the Afterthought, and which was a coffee house and a very good venue in on 4th Avenue, or the Village Bistro. They could not serve liquor. About drugs, of course, the Georgia Strait is the bellwether of all of these things. And looking back through old issues of the Georgia Strait, it is amazing how much of a focus there was on drugs, on the pleasure of them, on the problems that they gave, on being busted, on all of the issues of dealing with censorship and talking about them, and the police and so on and so forth. And the Strait itself, with its first edition here, the Great Bus Stop Bust. Now, this was not a drug bust. This was at the southeast corner of 4th Avenue and Arbutus in May 1967. And the hippies who were hanging around there were busted for vagrancy. And so first quiz of the evening, if anybody can remember this and put in the chat box, the name of the song that has the lyric in it, I just spent 16 days in the jailhouse for the crime of having no dough. So vagrancy was a way that the police had for clearing out undesirables, for clearing up the streets, and those laws were very, very much in effect. And you think of the difference with today, with homelessness on the streets and so on, that's really evolved. Now, the Georgia Strait got underway in 1967. It named in legendary fashion at the beer parlor of the Cecil Hotel, Dan McLeod and a group of friends who were putting out a poetry magazine called Tish came up with the name Georgia Strait. And so they began to publish this newspaper. And the great advantage that they had, both their nemesis and the great advantage that they had, was that they had a terrific enemy. They had just the ultimate enemy, and every cause needs a good enemy to solidify people. And that was Mayor Tom Campbell, Tom Terrific, as he was dubbed, and actually in the Vancouver Sun, I think, first. And So who was this character, the great enemy, Tom Campbell, who was the mayor spanning over this period? Well, he was a booster. He was a developer. Anything that could be knocked down and replaced was good. Anything like that that went along. And this photograph from the Vancouver Express in 1970, I think expresses something about Tom Campbell's world at that time. Also very definitely says something about the depiction of women in effectively advertising photographs at that time. But it was building new buildings. So Toronto Dominion Bank Tower, that is the centerpiece of Pacific Centre at that time. It was all tied in with the idea of a downtown freeway, of all of these changes that were going to modernize Vancouver, which people like Tom Campbell felt had fallen into a decline because it just had not come up with the changes that had been going on in society. What were these big changes that were becoming controversial at that time? Well, just like today with the Broadway subway, they are big real estate developments that are enabled by transportation plans. And in the 1960s, these transportation plans were freeways. Today's subway, but effectively it's the same thing. Not much has really changed. The Project 200 proposal, this was the Canadian Pacific Railway and Cadillac Fairview Development Corporation. You can see on the left-hand side the little tower with the W on it being the Woodward's building on Hastings. And you've probably already spotted the Hotel Vancouver just in the middle distance there. So this was going to be the waterfront with the freeway running along the front and across a third crossing on the edge of Stanley Park to the North Shore, and tying in with a freeway that would connect the Vancouver waterfront all the way out through Vancouver and out to the highway number 1 in Burnaby. Now, there were other changes that were going on, and Tom Campbell was very much a player in that. His imperial apartment buildings in the West End, it being an example. And this came out of a rezoning of the West End in the 1950s, and all of these buildings that were being built at that time were rental apartments. So the shift to condos didn't come a little bit later, and we will go back to that time. But Tom Campbell was really a big player as a developer, and then he became a developer politician. Gastown had gotten itself going about 1968, 1969. The local merchants had hired a retired logger by the name of Asen. They had commissioned a statue of Gassy Jack Dayton, the not really lamented at all statue of Gassy Jack that was just eliminated a couple of months ago. And Gastown was reinventing itself from being a warehousing area, kind of sleepy backwater, into being a boutique area. And that was one of the places, along with Chinatown, that was effectively going to be obliterated by the downtown freeway. Chinatown in the 1950s and the 1960s was really the jewel in Vancouver in terms of entertainment, neon, nightclubs, restaurants. It was, for all of Vancouverites, this is where people would go. And the location of the freeway and all of the changes that were going to come with it would have effectively destroyed it. The biggest change in terms of the people who were living in Vancouver was this idea of urban renewal. And the 1963 map here that is talking about ridding Vancouver of its blighted areas. And the one that was marked there, the East End, as it had been called, it was becoming called Strathcona, and it had been briefly called China Valley in the 1950s. It was going to be completely eliminated. Along the bottom of this map here, that's the freeway running along the bottom with the lines going over Gore Avenue running and for that waterfront freeway there. And you can see even that the street pattern would have been changed, and some towers and a lot of walk-up apartments and so on. It would have completely obliterated the neighborhood. I urge you all to make a note to build a better city. And if you Google "To Build a Better City" on YouTube, you will see this film done in 1964 by the Central Mortgage and Housing Corporation, and talking about the great improvements that urban renewal was going to make in people's lives. And it's an astonishingly arrogant document of the white planners in their white shirts telling the people who lived in Strathcona, who were poor people, who were ethnic and so on, how they were going to improve their lives. The neighborhood organized against that. They didn't want to live in the kind of buildings that the planners thought would be better for them, and particularly Strathcona Property Owners and Tenants Association, SPOTA, led by the Chan family. They organized the community at that point, and there were other communities that organized too, particularly in Granville, not as well known, but because the freeway was going to run effectively out Pryor and then Venables all the way through East Vancouver out to the freeway. And so people were organizing against this, but the real rallying point in that was going to be the complete obliteration of the Strathcona neighborhood that people had bought into and that they loved. Their activities attracted a few newcomers into it: a social worker by the name of Darlene Marzari, a lawyer who had been volunteering for Kool-Aid in Kitsilano named Mike Harcourt. And they came along and began to work with the SPOTA people and organizing the rest of the community and getting political support behind the idea of stopping urban renewal and killing the freeway. The climax of that period, January 9th, 1972, what was going to be a great celebration to open the Dunsmuir part of the Georgia Viaduct, which is of course still there today, turned into, I guess you would say, a near riot. The viaduct was blocked by a group of local people, yippies waving signs, young ecologists on 10-speed bicycles, including me. And they made it very, very difficult for the mayor's limousine and the entourage to get through. I found out later that they were in a bit of a hurry because there was a reception that was being put on at the Bayshore Inn for them. So this became this kind of seminal moment for it of crystallizing opposition to the downtown freeway. And the upshot of it was Tom Campbell just really lost it. And then this infamous statement of Maoist communists and hamburgers were endangering the crossing, and hamburgers were people without a university degree. So a lot of people ceased to take him seriously at all after that. And by the middle of 1972, it became very evident that he was not going to run for office. A legacy that came in out of this, well, there are a number of people here, and it's very interesting. You look at this, a number of them who were just about turning 40 at that time in 1972. I've put Alan Fotheringham in here, his columns in the Vancouver Sun, talking about the insider dealing of the Nonpartisan Association with land speculation in the downtown, really helped to sink Tom Campbell and the Nonpartisan Association. What came in was a new party, the Team Party. Very, very well-known people here, and particularly Mae Brown. She had deep connections into the federal Liberal Party, and the Liberal government at that time, they were the principal financiers of what was going to be the freeway expansion and of urban renewal. So this wave of change coming through into Vancouver at that time. We'll return to that a little bit later on of what happened, but these people came onto the scene at that point. Backing up a couple of years to the summer of 1970, and this is just, well, May 12th, 1970, this is about less than 2 weeks after the Kent State shootings. The local Yippie Party, the Youth International Party, which was a, how would you describe the Yippies? Anarchist, Dadaist, freewheeling, sort of fun-loving, super radical, stormed across the American border into Blaine, Washington to protest the Kent State shootings And then also tied in with that, and in another demonstration of the Anchican nuclear tests, which we'll talk about a little bit later. They were very active in Vancouver as a kind of a loose coalition of people. I mean, hard to, organized anarchists seems like an oxymoron, and I think it was, but they were able to get a large number of people out for any kind of demonstration. And the big issue that came up then in the summer of 1971 was the plan to build a Four Seasons hotel and apartment buildings right at the entrance to Stanley Park on some vacant land. It was actually less dense than an earlier proposal from 1965, which would have had 15 high-rise towers right at the entrance to Stanley Park. In May of 1971, yippies, all kinds of people, drifters, homeless, itinerants, occupied this space, turned it into an all-seasons park, a people's park, and tents, little shelters sprouted up there. There was a food service that was organized. And so this happened all the way through the summer with the busy Georgia Street traffic going by in the background. And what the camp looked like towards the end of the summer. By that time, public opinion had really shifted away from the idea of there being a development. And the federal government announced its plan to withdraw permission to use a particular water lot that the development needed. And the whole thing fell apart. And the Four Seasons Hotel, as we know, built at the corner of Dunsmuir and Howe Street in Vancouver. And it's been there now for the better part of 50 years. And now we gather that it isn't luxurious enough or whatever. So it is going to be torn down or replaced or something like that. But this was that entrance to Stanley Park in 1971. And the legacy of that is that we have that green space there now that never happened before. So probably in terms of particularly yippie demonstration and like the freeway fight, which was a coalition of people, this is one of the real legacies of that period. So over in Gastown, the place to shop, the destination shopping, bar area, restaurant area, and so on. The mayor became determined to clean up what he saw was this really bad area of drug dealing. And so with the Vancouver Police Force and a program called Operation Dustpan, they set out to round up all the drug dealers who were working in Gastown. And most of them, certainly in my memory, most of them were working the beer parlor of the Gastown Inn at the corner of Cordova and Cambie Street. A couple of writers for the Georgia Straight, Ken Lester and Eric Summer, decided that they were going to organize a street party, a street festival. And this is a poster for it. And, it's quite wonderful that this poster and the police riot baton are in the Vancouver Police Museum. It's worth, for all of the reasons of going to the police museum, it's worth going for that. And you can see on the poster there that in the advertisement, that a giant 10-foot joint, which was going to be the big piece of street theater that the organizers were going to do. So the cast of thousands effectively assembles in Maple Tree Square. The 10-foot joint is carried in. There are bands playing, drummers drumming, and the police are kind of hovering around the outside. Everything seems to be peaceful and so on. The joint gets lit. There are cheers of legalized dope, but effectively just a great big demonstration in a free country, it was thought at that time. And then all hell broke loose. The police charged on horseback, came in through the crowd, driving people away ahead of them. And with the result that it's probably the worst riot in Vancouver since the Ballantine Pier one in 1938, since the riots back, the labor riots back in the Great Depression. There was a sort of a vindication for the organizers. Ken Lester, who was a writer for Georgia Straight, both both Ken and Eric were writers for the Georgia Strait, were somewhat vindicated by the judicial review that the BC Supreme Court Justice Thomas Doan made. There's a lovely quote in this. In my opinion, Messrs. Lester and Summer, who testified at this inquiry, are two intelligent and dangerous radical young men. Their true motivation is their desire to challenge authority in every way possible. You couldn't really have said it better than that, but they were vindicated in the sense that the actual riot was of the police and not of the people who were there. You can read in that quote, Ken, very, very radical guy. He went on, he edited the Terminal City Express newspaper, then the Georgia Strait after that. And I think most famously now is known as a manager for DOA, the punk band. And he died just last year, about a year ago, so shortly before the 50th anniversary of probably his most famous event. Now, the environmental movement is another big thing that, of course, was getting going at that time. And SPEC, the Society for Pollution and Environmental Control, the oldest environmental organization in Canada, was founded in 1968 and really got the ball rolling on citizen activism and on bringing environmental preservation issues into the public eye. More highly publicized was Greenpeace, which emerged out of a benefit concert in 1970 to benefit an anti-nuclear protest group called the Don't Make a Wave Committee. And the anti-nuclear protest was against the Amchitka nuclear test in the Aleutian Islands, and very, very highly publicized and supported. And it had the money from the benefit concert at the Pacific Coliseum. Bob Hunter, the Vancouver Sun journalist, was of course reporting back and very important in that, as was the Georgia Strait and other newspapers and other media at that time, as this crew sailed away on this little fish boat rechristened the Greenpeace to witness and protest the nuclear test. Greenpeace, Suzuki Foundation, SPEC, really hard to estimate what the impact of this is, but of course we're living with the legacy of that and the ongoing, you could almost say the increasing radicalization of the environmental movement, although it was extremely radical in the 1970s. So that has really come full circle again. And David Suzuki, of course, the young UBC geneticist, is probably the most famous figure worldwide identified with the environmental movement from that period and more recently. There were squatters communities, North Vancouver particularly, highlighting Gene Walton's book that came out a few years ago about the Maplewood mudflats in North Vancouver. This, in a way, was a continuation of something that had been going on in Vancouver from the very beginning, of people just building little shacks along the waterfront. And 1959 news clipping on the left-hand side, most of the shacks are neat and well kept, and occupants include women and children, it says. So you fast forward to 1971, hairstyles have changed, there are women and children there, but it was bulldozed in 1971 by North Vancouver. A legacy, sort of. Finn Slough in Richmond is the last surviving squatters community in the Lower Mainland. And City of Richmond finally came to terms with having a squatters community on the south arm of the Fraser River. Picturesque, well-managed, almost something of a tourist attraction today. And a lot of people with very, very strong environmental credentials, people in the fishing industry, and simply people with not a lot of money live along there. Were we liberated? Sex, drugs, and rock and roll. So sexual liberation, did that really happen? Well, maybe, maybe it happened for some people, but there was an equally strong thing that I guess you would describe as a Playboy magazine culture of that period that just latched on to the idea of sexual liberation, indeed was probably a part of creating that. And so quiz number 2, if anybody can put it in the chat, what's the name of the song that has the line in it, "She was working in a topless place when I stopped in for a beer"? So if you can put that in the chat, maybe we'll have a draw if there's more than one correct answer at the end. In terms of the impact really locally, Georgia Strait, a bellwether as always on this. And this is the cover of the Georgia Strait in April 1971 that launched the takeover of the Georgia Strait by its female staff. And Ellen Woodsworth, who was quite recently a park board commissioner, was a layout artist at the Strait and one of the leaders of the occupation. And it went back and forth with women and men who disagreed with Dan McLeod's ownership of the Georgia Strait, believing that the Strait ought to be run as a collective. McLeod went to court, managed to get control of the paper. The dissident staff members went off and they started their own newspaper called The Great. And then there were other newspapers. I mentioned Terminal City Express that Ken Lester was editor of that came along not long after that in 1972, 1973. And the Strait evolved from there and became a very, very serious and valuable publication with doing a lot of long form journalism and getting away from, I guess, some of the more edgy things that they had been doing in the past. And feminist publishing also evolved. McCara and Press Gang Publishing, I'm just kind of noting there, they formed as collectives in the 1970s. And so the indication of women's rights and that very much an issue that came out of that period. My Christine, my partner, my wife, found this in a folder that had been in her desk for quite a number of years that she had kept from the early 1970s, a kind of a comic strip done by an anonymous sister that she had kept. Hatching. So what do you hatch? You hatch chicks. So this is a kind of, I guess, coming to women's rights evolution of a woman's thinking at that period. And I thought it was so well done that I would just put up a couple of little panels from it of women coming to terms with what she really believes a woman is, rather than letting men treat me in certain ways, worrying about the way she looked, et cetera, et cetera. And then this marvelous image from it of an indication that even though when we look back now at the writing and the behavior of people at that time, and it seems so liberated and it seems so edgy, that we could not really countenance the sexism that was still really rife at that time. Gay rights, another social justice issue that very much got going at that time. Kevin McKeown effectively was the public leader of it and writing a column called QQ Rights in the Georgia Strait beginning in 1970. That little logo there designed by Doug Bennett. Yes, that's Doug Bennett of Doug and the Slugs who did that. And Kevin still, 50 years later, 52 years later, still very, very involved in community issues and was going through there. And of course, we're aware of gay pride parades and things that were just unthinkable at that time. And the Georgia Strait's policy of free speech allowed this to begin to get out into the community. Indigenous rights, I don't want to say a huge amount about this. It's not really for me to say what was going on there, other than the landmarks of that period, the Calder decision of 1973, that the Nisga'a held title to their land. So this beginning, and then Dalgamuth comes along almost 20 years later, I think slightly more than 20 years later, beginning the process of Indigenous rights. A kind of a sideshow that went on in Vancouver involved Leonard Peltier, the American Indian movement activist who, during the occupation of Wounded Knee in South Dakota in 1973, 74. He was accused of murdering an FBI agent and he fled to Canada, and there was this long extradition hearing of him that went on into 1976. He was extradited to the States, and I gather he is still in prison in the United States now, 45 years later. I was thinking just of my own awareness of that at that time. The last article that I wrote for the Terminal City Express, and it never actually got published because the paper collapsed in 1973, was about the Shaughnessy Golf Course lease with the Musqueam people. And that's an issue that is not going to be resolved until the Musqueam actually take back the land there in the year 2033. So experiments and legacies, I guess. During this period, and particularly by the early 1970s, a period of very, very high unemployment, of youth unemployment and restive youth coming up. So the Pearson government in 1966 funds a group called the Company of Young Canadians. And the idea is this will be community activists who will work towards community betterment. And they get going then. And then 1971 is the big year for these job creation programs for young people for community benefits, some of them really being quite radical. OFY and LIP, those were the acronyms of the time. And they paid people on a grant to do work. A lot of it was things like daycare. For example, running little community newspapers and so on. And you would be paid about $100 a week, and the grants lasted for 4 to 6 months. And after that, you would go on unemployment insurance. And this was the way that a lot of people got started. The programs that came out of this and out of some of the other winds of change that were blowing, Vancouver Free University, I'll mention it in a minute. Western Front, the artist collective that's in Mount Pleasant at 7th and Scotia, I think it is, and still going after all these years. CCEC is a nonprofit credit union on Commercial Drive. Uprising Bakery started as a co-op, also on Commercial Drive. The East End Food Co-op, also on Commercial Drive. They're all coming out of this period of experimentation, of people working together, trying to better a community and do affordable things that were outside of the capitalist system. Key place from that period, the old Grandview Methodist Church, Grandview United Church, becomes the Vancouver Free University in 1969. And since 1973, Vancouver East Cultural Center with Tamanoos and so on, and still very much a part of the community and the cultural community in Vancouver. More experiments and legacies. Kool-Aid is still going, but it's actually going in Victoria, helping homeless people at the point. Pine Street Free Clinic, founded by Dr. John Blatherwick, a well-known name more recently. Head of the Coastal Health, I think Vancouver Coastal Health, and also Dr. Art Hister, who became quite famous as a media doctor in Vancouver. He moved here in the early 1970s to work at the Pine Street Free Clinic. Mental Patients Association, there has been some interesting pieces put up on YouTube, lectures about this community-based grant-supported way of caring for mental patients in the community. A lot of them were in Kitsilano at that time in the early 1970s, but very, very, very easy to find more information, videos and so on them on the web. And just a reminder, unemployment was really high for, particularly for young people during that period. Technological change. I didn't mention with the Georgia Straight and with the other newspapers, One reason why they were able to get going was because of cheap offset lithography, cheap offset printing that became available. There were printers in Vancouver, college printers, web press in Burnaby, and they were easy to typeset, easy to lay out. And so a paper like the Georgia Strait could be put together way more easily than the old traditional papers, which were all done with linotypes and much more expensive different presses. The other big tech change, the Sony Portapak video begins to come in, and you get groups of artists, Intermedia, Video In, Vivo, coming up, and people who are interested in video art and in video documentation and journalism coming up. I've put a note, arrow there to Krista Dahl. Krista was an artist in Seattle, and she and her husband and their 4 children, including Sean Pruce, came north into Canada in 1970, and they settled initially in Lund, on a farm in Lund, and then drifted back to the city and became very involved in the video movement. And the archives of the video archives in Vancouver, Vivo, are named the Krista Dahl Archives. And Sean Pruce is still very involved, but she's involved now in the cooperative movement still. There were other experiments that got off the ground and then faded. One was the idea of locally elected resources boards. So in a community like Kitsilano, you would elect representatives who would decide how discretionary money was going to be spent on social services in a community. Norm Levy, I mentioned, the Minister of Social Services for the provincial government. He was the coordinator of this. It did get going, but then when the NDP lost power in 1975, it was one of the early things that the social credit government canceled. Probably the greatest legacy of that period, cooperative housing. Came very much out of that time. You see there are 263 housing co-ops in British Columbia. This is the federal government money that housing advocates have been lobbying for well more than a decade, of trying to get this cooperative movement back going, because of the impact that it had at the time was really very significant. The circle there on the historic photograph is Old Quebec Manor at 7th and Quebec. A former apartment building. Tenants went on a rent strike, then they were able to get funding to buy the building, and they opened a cooperative, which is still very much there. Heritage building, it's a cooperative, it's affordable housing. You know, what could possibly be wrong with this type of model? And then this leads to what's probably the biggest of the utopian developments of that time, the South Shore of False Creek. If the city government gets going, you have an urban geographer and aldermen like Walter Hardwick and a planner like Seti Pendakur who are working on that, and you have very, very sympathetic Liberal government that is tied in, quite sympathetic to what the city government is doing, and you have a great piece of abandoned industrial land, a brownfield site, effectively the South Shore of False Creek. And so this experiment with co-op housing, with affordable housing, with a little bit of market rental, and then some condominiums as it comes in, really changes that area and sets a kind of a model that was somewhat repeated in Champlain Heights in southeast corner of Vancouver later in the 1970s, but never really to this degree, and never in so much of a publicized way. One of the people involved in this, Michael Geller, who's still very much involved in the scene in Vancouver, commenting on development issues and housing issues and so on. And you see Michael around and commenting on things. I haven't seen that jacket and tie lately, but you know, Michael came on the scene at that point as a young architect in the 1970s. What did hippie housing look like? I mean, we're talking about hippies, we're talking about drifters and young people and so on. Well, it was the houses that effectively had been left behind by the flight to the suburbs. And by some rezonings for apartment areas that had caused people, just absentee landlords, to hang on to the houses. Typically, they weren't that well maintained. Cast of characters. In some cases, the houses were lived in completely communally with just a single kitchen, shared bedrooms, and I mean shared in every way and form. But people living this way, living very affordably and living together. Some really quite inventive carpenter specials like the bus there that Sven Erik recorded in the 1970s. A lot of them, though, were houses that had been divided up into suites, even back into the 1930s, into the Depression. Kitsilano had a huge number of conversions of these big old houses that had been single-family houses. A basement suite, of course, maybe a fairly nice main floor suite and housekeeping rooms, shared bathrooms, and so on. Maybe a tiny little attic suite or other rooms up in the attic. And so this was really quite typical. It's, I guess, almost a deluxe way of people living, as opposed to the living communally. What was housing like? Well, it was just as bad as it is now. Vacancy rate in 1973, about the same as it is today. A lot of the sort of local information centers that came up were really housing boards. At the time that there was no internet, they would post housing listings for people. They would try to find housing, particularly for young families, for single mothers and so on, people with pets and so on. And this was very much the way. And there was development going on, and it was rental development, but it was resisted by, for example, the Vancouver Tenants Council. 10-story high-rise apartment proposed for Cornwall Avenue around Kitsilano Beach. Opposed. Why opposed? Because the housing was not considered to be affordable, and it wasn't considered to be affordable for families. You could be running this stuff today, yesterday. This is exactly the same situation that Vancouver is in now. And the idea of neighborhoods being gentrified, of tenants being pushed out and dislocated. And by 1972, this is still almost entirely a rental issue. The provincial government responded by putting in a whole number of rules, by rather bureaucratizing landlord-tenant relationship. Some of you might remember the Office of the Rentals Man and the hiring of a man named Barry Clark, who was a former CKWX hotliner, if I remember him. And he became the Rentals Man and was much spoofed for that title, wearing a cape and a sort of a Superman costume with a big R on the front. And Len Norris did a brilliant, if perhaps unfair, spoof of what was happening to the rental market at that time with this cartoon. But by 1974, the biggest issue was condos. The Strata Title Act had come in 1966, and the uptake on it had been very, very slow. But by 1973, 1974, there was a huge number of conversions of apartment buildings where the tenants were told either buy your suite or get out. And to the point that City Council actually passed a motion demanding that there be a moratorium on the conversion of rental apartments. So rental housing was really tight. And then the issue, in a way, came to a head with a big demonstration in Kitsilano in March and April 1974 over a condominium high-rise project at the corner of 3rd and Balsam. And a group of people, I can't quite recognize me and Christine in there, but a group of us did everything that we could to stop the development of this project that had been proposed. When you read back over this, you realize how little history changes. The project now proposed will provide condominiums selling for $50,000 and up to adults only. It displaced 2 small apartment blocks and some houses where 90 people on low and medium incomes were paying an average of $150 a month rent. This is the root of the housing crisis. Poor and average out, rich in. There is no housing crisis for those who can afford $50,000 minimum for a suite. As I say, you just add a 0, maybe multiply it by 20, and you've got exactly what's going on in Vancouver today. There was an injunction that was passed. The building got built. It, in a sense, got absorbed into gentrifying Kitsilano at that time. The city, and then with federal government money, responded by coming up with a couple of programs that were going to enhance the public realm, the neighborhood improvement program, and also a program that was going to help people fix up their houses. So the RRAP program gave grants to people who stabilized foundations, put coats of paint on houses and everything to try to improve the housing in that area. And this happened elsewhere. But just as a final little quiz, okay, what do you think the answer is? I won't leave you in suspense. The answer is 1967. The speaker was Henry Block of the real estate company Block Brothers. So it's a long time since we began to have the affordability issues that we are experiencing today. A lot of this was addressed in the Habitat Forum conference, the last hurrah of hippiedom, with its organizer, Al Clapp, a very significant person in the BC film industry, as well as organizing this and being part of the design program for Granville Island. And this took place out at the old air base at Jericho, and the hangars were torn down by the park board not that long afterwards. A photograph of the big symposiums that happened in these hangars during the time of this 1976 Habitat Forum. Another really big one at that time, of course, is Granville Island being deindustrialized. Note up in the top left corner, if you can spot them, the little squatters community up there, the little squatter shacks on what is now going to be the Sinnock high-rise development put on by the Squamish Nation. This is an idea supported very strongly by the federal Liberal government, and particularly Ron Bassford, local cabinet minister. A couple of brilliant young designers, Norm Hodson and Joost Bakker, had the idea of retaining as many of the buildings as possible and doing this wonderful open air thing that almost effectively took over Vancouver's imagination in the early 1980s. Poor old Gaston got left almost completely behind. That idea, you can fire a cannon down Water Street and the only things they'll hit are memories by 1980. Another thing, Agricultural Land Reserve came out of the NDP government in the early 1970s. I understand that Bob Williams, the cabinet minister who was responsible for it, has just written a memoir that is going to be published this spring. So that will be an interesting read. And one final thing, heritage preservation came out of that period. The Burks building being the watershed issue. The Burks building at the southeast corner of Granville and Georgia Street. You can see it in the pictures there. The city government, which wanted to have the building saved, realized that it had no power to save the building. And so it went to the provincial government and said, you must give us the power to designate heritage buildings. This is crazy what is happening to our city. While the provincial government was mulling this over in the spring of 1974, the Burks building is probably one of the most beautiful buildings ever built in the city, closed down. And in that kind of wonderfully anarchistic spirit of the time, there was a mock funeral that was held March 24th, 1974 on Georgia Street for the Burks building that continued on west along Georgia Street. You can see in the extreme distance, just the edge of the Burks building there. And this wonderful group of hippies, I guess you would call them, some of them in these crocheted videotape vests that were probably made by the artist Evelyn Roth. And the parade continued along Georgia Street. Burks building was torn down, but we ended up with a legacy of a heritage program and some heritage designations and a fairly successful program. Whatever happened to the gentle hippie? Well, wasn't really around for all that long. I first saw skinheads in London in 1971, and I thought, well, things are changing. And of course, the Altamont rock festival in California at the end of 1969, which had the Hells Angels as security, that was just a nightmarish issue. So that idea that there were these peace and love people, yes, there were, but it didn't really last as long as I think some of us would like to think it would have. What are the last relics of it? Well, the NAM on 4th Avenue. That wonderful little trip back. This is from its Facebook page. Sorry, we miss you due to COVID. This is just put up very, very recently. And then the other one from that time, Banyan Books and Sound, that has been around since 1970. I didn't really talk about spirituality and healing, not one of my strong points, I suppose, of knowing what was really going on there, but that was also a very big issue of that time. I thank you all for being interested in this and looking for parallels between then and what we're going through now, and wish you all a good evening. I'll try to get out of the screen and have a look at the chat, and I think Sarah is going to conduct a bit of a chat with some questions. So thank you very much. What have we got?
Yeah, some people had some
okay, Stephen
answers to your
Blackson,
question.
the band, right. Okay, exactly. The song, The Shape I'm In. Yeah, The Shape I'm In, Frederick. Oh yeah. Hi, Fritz Neumeyer. The Shape I'm In by the band. So that's that lyric and that was the one, 16 days in a jailhouse for the crime of having no dough. What are my thoughts on the destruction of Gassy Jack's statue? Well, it's kind of an erasure, I suppose, of a period of history, but I mean, what a ne'er-do-well character to have a statue to. And you know, when you think about the merchants around 1970, they're looking for a mascot. Like, we don't have a Wyatt Earp here, we don't have a Jesse James, we don't have a kind of an American type of hero for a saloon area, and so they turn around and they pick a guy who's a bootlegger to do this. And yeah, they're not going to pick a social worker and do a statue of a person like that. But, you know, still is sort of a ne'er-do-well and everything. You know, kind of an interesting exercise. I think, I don't know how you would interpret something like that. And the issues are probably too complex for what we're talking about tonight, because they get into all sorts of issues of well, you know, all the issues. I think everybody does. Stephen Blackson again, Bob Dylan, Tangled Up in Blue. That was, I stopped in for a beer, yeah. And okay, yeah, a couple of other people getting in there too. Co-op Radio also came out. Thank you very much, Jill Kelly, for Co-op Radio. I just completely forgot about them. Co-op Radio were in the building right on Pigeon Park, as it's called. I think it now has maybe an Indigenous name that I can't remember, but right at that corner of Hastings and Carroll Street. And out of those grants in the 1970s. And so you had video coming in with community cable. Cablevision was one of the big successes in Vancouver in the 1960s and the 1970s, where you had the Canadian Radio and Television Commission mandating Cablevision companies to put up these community cable channels. And so you would have local events covered by volunteers carrying a porta-pack and these things. And, you know, arguably they were amateurish and so on, but it got the message out to people. And Co-op Radio was the same way. What happened to the Strathcona land still being used for horses? Bit of a mystery there of the Strathcona lands. Maybe you can add something to the chat and I can figure that out. Yeah, canceled by civil protest, but because of problems with federal funding. Well, federal funding and provincial funding began to fade away from urban renewal. In even the late 1960s, they were beginning to have questions of it. And that's part of that debate that goes on about how lucky were we being out here on the West Coast? We could see what happened in Seattle with freeways particularly. We could see what was happening in Toronto and Montreal with freeways and with urban renewal. If you know Toronto and Cabbagetown and the fights for Regent Park, and you could see the problems that were coming up with that kind of housing. So the provincial government was beginning to have cold feet, and this is a Trudeau government. It's trying to reach out to youth, reach out, be a little bit more progressive. So definitely federal funding, and even I gather that I remember that the Bennett government withdrew provincial funding support for urban renewal at that time. Peace movement more in the 80s. Well, the peace movement in a way was almost more in the 60s and came back in the 80s as the Vietnam War began to wind down. People turned their attention here more to the environmental movement, I would say, in the 1970s. You have such a part of Vancouver for a few years, and particularly you get Ronald Reagan elected in 1980, and you get that absolute Cold War brinkmanship that is happening of the standoff between the United States and Russia, and those huge protests of plugging the Broad Street Bridge and so on. So yes, in the 80s, yes, in the 60s, somewhat in the 70s, in the early 1970s, and peace movement, I guess you put in nuclear disarmament in that too, as being really the touchstone for Greenpeace and everything for the founding there. There's a person who is writing about a Toronto-based book, recently did a book on the activism in the long 60s in Toronto. Seemed to be more based on international issues, whereas your lecture was more focused on local issues. Well, I would argue that certainly the environmental movement was an international issue. That Vietnam was an international issue, but yes, there were local issues. And in Toronto, I just mentioned urban renewal and so on. Marvelous book, if anybody can find it, called A Citizen's Guide to City Politics by James Lorimer, published in 1972, that covers a lot of that ground, and in Vancouver, Toronto, Montreal, and so on. Yes, don't forget alternative schools starting in 1971. Vancouver's first public one was City School. And yes, we're talking about Vancouver Free University, and we're talking about and we're talking about a whole number of these things, and the different grants that came in. A lot of them were for daycare. Daycare was a really big thing for women, and abortion was a really big thing for women. The National Council of Women with the abortion caravan that they chained themselves to the front door of the Parliament building in 1970. So real radicalism there. That the Henry Morgenthaler's legal battles for abortion. I mean, there's really so much to learn. Coming in, do I have any comments on the Jesus movement that was happening during this time, including the Jesus People's Army, which was started in Seattle and had a substantial operation in Vancouver? I don't remember them at all. I don't remember them at all. What I remember was the Campus Crusade for Christ being a big thing at that point. But spiritualism, Hare Krishnas, I didn't mention them. The famous scenes of the Krishnas dancing and chanting underneath the marquee at the Hudson's Bay Company building at the corner of Granville and Georgia, and the looks on the people's faces, it was really worth the price of admission. You would go down there and you would watch the people walking by the Krishnas and the looks that they gave them and so on and so forth. But the Krishnas are really part of a spiritual part of the community, I guess you would say. Could I discuss the classical joint and Le Chat Noir? I think if I could remember those nightclubs clearly, it would indicate that I wasn't really there. And that famous thing about the 1960s and the 1970s, sorry, I'm not really able to talk about that. But there were a lot of clubs, and I would recommend that you pick up Aaron Chapman's book, Vancouver After Dark, which has got a real overview on all of that, and going back 1940s, 1950s, and even before then, of the kind of clubs that were there. Earth Day, and Earth Day, first Earth Day, 1970. So And I believe it was at Berkeley, but there was an echo of it on the UBC campus in 1970. I believe they buried a Volkswagen in Berkeley, which I took personal offense to because I thought that they were probably about the best thing that you could get at the time. But the Earth Days got going at that point.
Kevin had a comment about, he said the Chat Noir was a coffee house, the classical joint was a great jazz club.
Yeah, and my fading fuzzy memory of 50 years ago says I can't really remember these. I mean, there were people would remember who knew the Kitsilano scene, would remember the Afterthought Coffee House. I think I mentioned it. It was sad to see that old Russian community hall, the old theater, vandalized the other day. And then the Village Bistro at the corner of 4th and Arbutus. The Poppy family playing there and a lot of the local bands at that time. A little more about the community in Richmond, where people squatted in the 70s and are still there today. Were they given title to the land? I don't believe so. I think they are still squatting there, but they're allowed there. This was a community of Finnish people, of Finns, so Finn Slough, as you imagine. Fishermen and people who worked along the river and so on, effectively poor people who were there. And it's gone along today. The people who are there today, there's some old people, there's some artists. A number of them go down to the bottom of number 4 Road in Richmond. I think if you look on the web for Finn Slough, you'll find quite a lot of information about it. But there's a beautiful little trail that walks along the edge, and it's like time travel. It is really worth going down there, and you can go down there and maybe imagine yourself that you were on the Maplewood mudflats, or maybe earlier in the 1940s at Kate's Park, and you run across Malcolm Lowry, the artist who was there and writing or drunk or whatever it was he was doing at the time. Okay, yeah, the alternate schools I think we've addressed. The Citizens Guide Lorimer is in the Vancouver Public Library System. Really very, very funny. And that little clip of from the Globe and Mail of Tom Campbell saying it's a plot about the Maoist Picos and hamburgers, that's out of there. Tell him about Donald Gutstein's book, Vancouver Limited. Yeah, Donald Gutstein, kind of radical activist in a whole pile of ways. I remember Don being around with the West Broadway Citizens Committee, and the West Broadway Citizens Committee was a group that organized the protests against that condo project at 3rd and Balsam, amongst a whole number of other housing issues in that area. And he wrote a book, Vancouver Limited, which is a very good take on the property industry, effectively, as it was called. So came out probably 1976, I think, maybe a little bit later. I can't remember. It might even have come out in the 1980s. It's been a while since I looked at that. Below that, just to note the role of neighborhood houses in community development and many social issues. Yes, Kit's House being one of them, Gordon House in the West End, the community groups used them for meeting space. There were all sorts of organizations that operated out of them. And it was that idea of communities coming together around common causes that I think was very significant at that time. Longer one, which is really about the future, which inevitably happens to you when you talk about the past. About the Broadway plan and the Making Room initiative of 6-unit dwellings on 33-foot lots. None of the stuff appears to be affordable. None of it will be affordable until housing speculation is brought under control. I would say that was an issue 50 years ago. But I would also say that there is a real need for people to come together, to get together the way they did in the 1970s around cooperatives, around alternate forms of housing. There has to be a better way of doing tenure, if I can call it that, whether it's co-op ownership or whether it's strata ownership or fee simple ownership, then this idea of everybody having a little unit and all of that happening, because and also there must be some way of getting an evolution of our branch plant economy where workers here are paid so much less than they are paid elsewhere. I remember a comment several years ago from an urban land economist whose name escaped me. He said, Vancouver has the wages of Halifax, the prices of San Francisco, and the economy of Honolulu. And that's several years ago, and that was somebody who had made his money in urban land economics. As I say, I don't think we're going to get affordable housing out of anything that's happening unless there's a real rein and a real taxation on housing speculation. Yeah, we got here on, mentioned Chat Noir, Last Chance Saloon, yeah, 4th and Arbutus, and coming along there. And I say, I'm not sure whether people can spot the chat on that, but a Finslow history has gone up on there. Vancouver Limited, 1975. Thank you for putting that up. That was when Don Lexon's book came out. And yeah, there was just some, I think probably on Facebook or something, there was some contact with him not that long ago. There, you do the arithmetic on people who were around, and so you add 50 years to people who were young adults at that time, and you're getting into a pretty geriatric group. And that idea of Ken Lesser having died last year, and other people, Daniel Wood, the journalist, died. Jim Green died several years ago. There are a number of people have gone, and so this history. If you have this history in your mind, if there are things that you did, things that you know about, try to write it down somewhere, try to post it somewhere where other people can find it. And we can tie all these things together. Feminist history, gay history, there's a lot of this has been recorded and information going into the archives. Thank goodness we have the City of Vancouver Archives, which has been very open to collecting this type of material out of private collections and so on, and making it accessible so that we don't lose track of all of this kind of interesting history from 50 years ago.
Absolutely. I mean, the BC Gay and Lesbian Archives was a huge addition to their collection. So if anyone has any last questions, we do have a couple minutes if you want to get that in. And if not, then we'll wrap things up. I think there's one in there from Maureen.
Okay, 3 individuals from the 60s, 70s who had the most significant impact on shaping the city's future. The city. I suppose you would, 60s, 70s, I mean, I suppose you would probably have to put Walter Hardwick in there as, False Creek and planning and so on. Who else would I say? Well, I'm going to say Dan McLeod, publisher of the Georgia Straight for about 50 years. Dan, kind of a roller coaster career and everything, but he kept the damn thing going. He kept the paper going, and became a sort of a the wonderful mouthpiece of a free press and of all the alternate ideas and so on. How does the hippie movement in Vancouver compare to other cities? What made Vancouver special? I think it's that sort of Haight-Ashbury North. We're out on the West Coast. We were something of a destination for people from all over Canada, but people, if there's anybody from Toronto, they're going to say, what about Yorkville? Yorkville was a very, very cool place at that time too. When did Vancouver Special start being built? Well, about 1965. You can argue tied in with opening up of immigration in the 1950s, more immigrants arriving who wanted to live in extended families. So another part of that period, the longest tenured publisher of a Canadian newspaper. Yeah, I mean, I guess that must be Dan McLeod. I don't think Ma Murray quite fits in there with the Lillooet paper, but wouldn't be that far behind. Ray Spaxman, Michael Geller is putting up there. Ray Spaxman was the planner who was hired in 1973, and another way. Bob Hunter, Greenpeace visionary. Yeah, Bob Hunter was very, very significant. And I think also when you think about the Vancouver Sun at that period, we're talking about the Strait, but you think about what a big tent the Vancouver Sun was. It had Len Norris, it had Bob Hunter, it had Alan Fotheringham, it had some quite right-wing columnists. Who's the guy whose name has gone out of my mind, who became the editor very, very briefly of the Vancouver Sun. All of these people, I sat on Ma's knee, that's Ma Murray's knee, and Doug Collins, yes. Yeah, Doug Collins was, became a very controversial right-wing person at that point. David Suzuki, obviously you have to put him in there, and his impact is Vancouver and then way, way beyond that. Pat Carney, Vancouver Sun journalist, yes, going back in the 1950s, and then she became a senator. She was important. Al Clapp, very interesting character. I attended his sort of celebration of life about 5 or 6 years ago. Grace McCarthy was there, the Socred cabinet minister who was responsible for setting up the BC Film Commission. She spoke very warmly of him. So you have these people, these sort of visionary types. Maybe Jim Green. Jim Green came here in the 1960s. Housing activists and so on. There are a lot of people who were involved in that. Yeah, I see Al Clapp put up there in the chat line. So. But a lot of really very, very interesting people, and maybe a bit of a brief blip, but it never went away, and maybe it's coming back, this kind of activism. I hope so.
Well, thank you everyone for your incredible questions. It's always nice to have that kind of engagement when we are doing a virtual session. I know we all really miss being in person. Hopefully soon enough we'll be back to that. I just wanted to take a minute and say thank you to everyone for coming tonight. Thank you for participating in our first evening lecture of the spring season. Thanks to Michael for presenting. As always a wealth of knowledge. So if you're interested in learning more about Vancouver's history, we've mentioned some resources today. The VHF website has lots of great things that you can kind of use to start your discovery. The Heritage Site Finder, Places That Matter, Community History resource are really great hubs to start with. Built heritage and significant places in the community, as decided by the community. Just a few events that might be of interest that are coming up. Our next virtual event will be an old school workshop, and we're going to be partnering with the City of Vancouver Archives on March 23rd, and we're focusing on how you research the history of the building online. The next evening lecture in our series will be on women's labor history. So Bailey Gardens from the BC Labour Heritage Centre will be joining us on April 26th for a talk. And we have a number of other events. We have a virtual stroll. We have some other workshops and heritage lunch and learns coming up. So have a look and see if any of those are of interest. But that's all for tonight. And thanks again for joining us. We hope to see you again sometime soon. Have a great evening.